You're listening to Finding Fortitude, a podcast that aims to help former athletes take good care of their minds and bodies through sustainable, evidence-based health habits. I'm your host, Dr. Tori Williams, a physical therapist, coach, and fellow former athlete who is ready to be part of the change in healthcare and who is on a mission to learn and share about all things health and well-being so that you can be equipped with the knowledge and tools to live your best life. As a reminder, nothing shared on this podcast should be considered medical advice. Let's get started. Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to Season 2 of Finding Fortitude. I am finally back with a brand new season of the podcast, and I cannot wait to get into it. It has been an eventful break for me, which I'll get into shortly, but I first want to acknowledge that I never really formally announced the end of Season 1 on here, and I do want to apologize for that. I did make the announcement on Instagram, but I dropped the ball on announcing it here on the podcast, which is the most important. Honestly, I'm still getting the hang of this whole podcasting thing, and deep down, I know that I really just wanted to do one more finale episode for Season 1, but because of all the things going on in my life at that time, it just wasn't in the cards, and I had to deprioritize it due to everything else, which I'll talk about shortly. But I will own that newbie mistake and promise to be better next time. I'm sorry for leaving you hanging like that. But I am super excited to be back now. Over the next 12 episodes, I will be interviewing some of my favorite people, and we'll be diving into a variety of topics around managing persistent pain, leadership and life after sport, mastering your mindset around healing and recovery, pelvic health during pregnancy and postpartum, and much, much more. You can also count on a few solo episodes like this one today, just from yours truly. I am so pumped. It's going to be a super informative season, super insightful, and full of enlightening stories from former athletes just like you. So before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to check in with you. We are over halfway through 2024, and in typical unprecedented times fashion, there's a lot of really heavy stuff going on in the world. And with that, I truly hope that you are taking good care of yourself. I was listening to a podcast recently called Financial Feminist by Tori Dunlap, and she had a guest on. I think it was a replay of an old episode. She had Tara Schuster on, and the quote that she said that really stuck with me is that self-care, when done authentically, is community care. Because you are a part of your community, and how you act really, really affects the rest of us. I think that is so true, because the only way that we can continue to show up in spaces and communities we exist in a positive way and demanding change is by first taking care of ourselves. So, starting there. Secondly, because we only have 5 months left in 2024, or less than 5 months now, if you're someone who likes to set goals or intentions at the beginning of the year, now might be a good time to check back in on those things if you haven't already. And this is just to have an honest evaluation of how you're doing without judgment, of course. We practice self-compassion around here. And even if it feels like your goals are a lost cause at this point, the year is not over yet, my friend. Now could be a great time to reassess and change paths for the rest of the year instead of waiting until January to really gain clarity on your current needs, desires, and goals. Even if that means you're completely changing your mind, abandoning everything that you said at the beginning of the year, and setting different goals or intentions for the last few months of the year, I'd love to invite you to practice breaking that pattern of perfectionism and all or nothing thinking by really allowing yourself to be human and start fresh at any moment. All right? Okay, that's my quick pep talk for today. If you want a little extra motivation to set some of those goals for the second part of the year, or third, fourth, whatever quarter, I'd recommend going back and listening to the hashtag PT Power Couple New Year's episode from season 1. I think it was episode 10, where my now husband, Joe, and I talk a little bit about goal setting. Speaking of my husband, that still feels funny to say, during the break from this podcast, I got married to my best friend, Joe. We had a small, intimate wedding just outside of Yosemite National Park with the help of our closest family and friends, and it was hands down one of the best days of my life. It was a lot of work, and we may never recover financially. Just kidding, sort of. Hashtag millennial problems. But I really do think in the end it was worth it. It just goes by so fast, and I just want to relive the day over and over again after all of that preparation and planning. So I'm glad we at least have so many really awesome pictures from the day. If you are getting married or planning to get married, I definitely recommend investing in a good photographer/videographer if you have the budget for that. I just think of all the things, the photographer for us was really important and worth the investment because, like I said, it goes by so fast, and that's the one thing you're going to have to really relive that day. So I have shared some of the photos from our wedding on Instagram, so if you are curious, you can head over there to check it out. But the wedding was just super special. We got to spend some time in Yosemite before the wedding day for a private vow reading with just Joe and I and our photographer. And then after the wedding, we went back to Yosemite to do some hiking, and it was lovely. The waterfalls inside the park that time of year in May were so full, just absolutely iconic and beautiful. So if you have not been to Yosemite, 12 out of 10 recommend. What are you waiting for? Please go. It is the most magical place and my favorite place on earth. The other big event that happened during the break between season 1 and season 2 was that I ran my second ever half marathon. It was 2 weeks after the wedding, which, yes, if you're thinking this, it was a bit problematic and I would not necessarily recommend it for everyone, but we did it. It took place in South Lake Tahoe. It was beautiful and super rewarding, and it was especially fun because we got to do it with some of our close friends, one of which, who has been on this podcast, you may remember, Catherine Ward from episode 8, the sports dietitian who talked about dietary considerations for runners. Needless to say, you can bet she made sure that we were well-fueled before, during, and after that race, and she also kicked all of our asses in that race, but we had a lot of fun. And there's more to the story behind this half marathon, and that's what I want to spend the rest of this episode talking about, because amid training for this race, I developed some foot and ankle pain. And so I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to discuss some of the nuances around managing pain while training for a sport or activity, particularly as a former athlete who has a pretty high standard for themselves when they sign up for a race or an event like this. And I'm hoping that you can take some things away and learn from my experience. Because even though I am a physical therapist, I still get pain, I still get injured, and I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. That doesn't make me any less of a physical therapist. It just makes me human, unfortunately. So let's get into it. To start, I want to rewind a little bit and provide you with some background information about my past medical history and my training history leading up to the time when I started experiencing pain. I think this is important context to have, and this is where I always start when I'm consulting with a new client because it can be critical for understanding why pain may have started in the first place, and it can also give us some hints about how to maybe best manage that pain, or at least how to prevent future instances of pain and how to keep the individual healthy moving forward. So, starting with my past injury history, a long time ago in junior high, I fractured my ankle, and I honestly don't even remember which one it was, but it happened while playing basketball in PE. I came down on someone's foot, rolled my ankle really bad, and was down for the count. At that time, I was given a walking boot by a medical provider. I can't even remember whether it was urgent care or like my primary care doctor. But unfortunately, they never gave me or prescribed any physical therapy afterward. They didn't send me to a physical therapist, which Now, being a physical therapist, this makes me pretty sad because there's a chance that getting some high quality rehab at that time could have helped reduce the risk for future injuries. But instead, after this, I started having frequent ankle sprains on both sides while playing sports. I ran cross country, I played basketball, and I played softball, and I have rolled my ankle in all 3 sports, both of them. And again, I never had any formal physical therapy after any of these incidents. I just started wearing ankle braces while playing sports, which wasn't a foolproof method, obviously. And so the big problem with this is that when we sprain our ankle, which means we overstretch one or more of our ligaments, those ligaments usually heal on their own over 6 to 12-ish weeks for a grade 1 or 2 sprain, but it doesn't necessarily recover all of its original elastic properties or its original length, which means the passive support that the ligaments normally provide to the joint of the ankle and foot diminish after a sprain, and this just tends to get worse with repeated sprains. Unfortunately, this can result in significantly increased risk for future ankle sprains. In fact, I think the number one predictor for an ankle sprain is a previous ankle sprain. And in some cases, when this continues to happen, it can lead to joint instability, which is essentially what I developed. So that's a big thing to understand about my past medical history. The other interesting thing to note here is that over the past 4 or 5 years, I've also recognized that I have some of the signs and symptoms of generalized joint hypermobility, which is basically a connective tissue disorder that results in excessively mobile and bendy joints, among other things. And this, not surprisingly, increases my risk for ligamentous and other musculoskeletal injuries. So this likely had a role in why I was prone to ankle sprains to begin with anyways. But it's also really led me to double down on my commitment to resistance training, because we know that resistance training is one of the best things that you can do to reduce your risk for injuries and pain, especially when you have a hypermobile body. That's because your muscles and tendons become really important for stability of your joints when your ligaments aren't doing their job very well, right? So the only way to make your muscles stronger is to expose them to progressive load, i.e. resistance training. And I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of getting through this part relatively quickly. But yeah, we can go ahead and add strong and stable joints to the list of things that lifting weights can do for you, other than making you quote unquote bulky, ladies, talking to you. The last thing that's important to consider with my injury history is that 3 years ago while snowboarding, I experienced a pretty severe left ankle injury. There weren't any broken bones that I knew of. I honestly never had any imaging done because I didn't think it was necessary. But there was definitely some gnarly soft tissue damage, likely involving my Achilles tendon. And that recovery was the slowest and toughest of any ankle injury I had experienced up to this point. The rehab was slow and frustrating, and it took me almost 2 years to be able to run even short distances without pain. And in that time, obviously, my body compensated and relied a lot more on my right leg, which is a totally necessary and normal thing to happen after an injury. But I had to work really hard, and still do work really hard, to try to close that gap in strength and power between my 2 lower limbs. Tendons are responsible for storing and releasing energy, which makes you more springy for things like jumping and running. And similar to ligaments, tendons also often don't fully recover their original springy properties after an injury. So, all of that is, I think, pretty much all of the relevant past medical history of mine to keep in mind leading up to this most recent bout of pain. The other important piece of information to take into consideration when we're trying to understand someone's pain is their training history. So, in other words, what is your experience with exercise, with physical activity, and training, and what were you doing in training leading up to the pain and injury? So, for me, this was my second time training for and running a half marathon. But the first one was 8 years ago on my 21st birthday. That's a pretty significant gap, but I did run cross country in middle school and high school, and I also enjoyed running recreationally during college and grad school just to stay in shape. So running long distances is definitely not a new thing for me. However, leading up to the time when Joe and I and our friends started talking about signing up for this half marathon last fall, I had not really been running much at all. My love for running honestly had kind of gotten sidelined after my snowboarding incident because running was painful for a long time. And I really lost a lot of my conditioning for running. But over the winter, I set a goal to be more consistent with cardiovascular exercise. I wanted to reach the minimum physical activity guidelines for Americans, which is 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise and 2 days a week of strength training. I really had the strength training piece down. In fact, I'd been doing that maybe 3 or 4 times a week, but running was painful and I hated the stationary bicycle for cardio. I still do. And I'm a terrible swimmer and I had no desire to get into the pool or in the winter. And I didn't have a gym membership to use like other cardio equipment. So I decided to try to start running again. I ran maybe twice per week, but no more than 2 or 3 miles at a time. And I was doing a lot of walk-jog intervals to try to build back up and avoid aggravating my left ankle from that snowboarding incident that I'd had a few years ago. Fast forward to 2024, and about 3 months before the race, I felt like I had a pretty solid base, and my left ankle was doing great with running. I'd had no problems there. So I started a formal running plan for the half marathon and began slowly increasing my mileage each week. That was honestly going pretty well, but around the same time, or maybe shortly after, Joe and I also started playing in a recreational pickleball league 1 night per week, which we had never done before. And remember, this was also now 2.5 months before the wedding, which Joe and I basically planned all by ourselves. And if you've ever planned a wedding, you know that the last few months can be a bit stressful. And I can also definitely say that I was staying up later at night, so my sleep was not as consistent as usual. So looking back, I realized that I was really pushing the boundaries of my body's capacity and what I could physically and mentally handle at the time. And sure enough, after a couple of weeks of increasing my running mileage, I started noticing some mild heel pain at the bottom of my right foot. Not my left foot, my right foot. And zooming out, we can see 4 pretty distinct things that may have contributed to a higher risk for injury around this time. Can you spot them? Number 1 was my history of hypermobility and ankle sprains. That's just kind of a baseline risk factor for certain injuries. Number 2, my previous left ankle injury that was likely still resulting in some compensations, although I did my best to mitigate that through strength training and a slow on-ramp to running with walk-jog intervals. Number 3, adding a new physical activity to my routine at the same time as increasing my running mileage, and particularly a new physical activity which requires some running, cutting, quick changes of direction, and wearing flat court shoes. And number 4, high stress levels. Oh, and number 5, and there's a 5th one, inconsistent sleep. Now, of course, these are just speculations based on what we know right now from the evidence about things that can increase your risk for injury. But I would argue that in most cases, we really can't ever zero in on the exact cause of pain or injury, because it's just that complicated and multifaceted. But I do think these are a few of the things that probably contributed. I like to tell people it's probably a perfect storm of things that usually happens, unless you're in like a contact injury or a motor vehicle accident or something like that, where there's a pretty clear mechanism of injury. When these kind of slow, gradual pains come on, it's a lot harder to zero in on exact cause. Regardless, I do think it's still important to have this conversation when we get injured or start experiencing pain so that we can look back and try to learn something from it. And trust me, there was still a lot more to learn here. So continuing to take you on the journey with me, after I started noticing some of that mild heel pain in my right foot, I decided to skip my next run and just keep walking and doing my usual strength training. When I tried to run again several days later, the pain was still there. So I decided to pull back and do a lot more like walk-jog intervals like I had done previously last fall, in hopes that it would not get worse and that it would get better. I was correct in that while doing this, the pain started improving. I was able to slowly increase my walk-jog intervals over the course of a couple weeks, and I was feeling pretty darn good, like things were heading in the right direction. Which brings up another good, quick lesson here, that you don't always have to completely stop your activity in order for pain to improve. Sometimes a temporary pause is necessary, and in some instances, like with bone stress injuries, you do need to stop and pull back from running. But in many cases, you don't have to do that. Oftentimes, you just need to modify your activity for a little while until your body can tolerate it a little bit better, which is usually the approach that I offer to my clients before pulling back completely, and that's the approach that I often take. So, things were improving, but then, in a sudden turn of events, we lost our first pickleball game. Dun, dun, dun. Joe and I don't like losing, of course. We are former athletes. So we decided to stay after our match to get some more practice in and scrimmage for basically another hour and a half straight on top of the hour that we had already been there playing. So double the amount of playing, a little bit more than double, than what we had been used to in previous weeks. Again, hindsight is always 20/20. This was definitely not a smart move, especially because I had started feeling a little bit more heel pain while we were scrimmaging. But at the time, I was like, oh, it's not that bad. It's not bad enough to stop me from playing. And I just kind of brushed it off to the side. And it wasn't until I got home that I realized the pain was indeed getting quite a bit worse. And the next morning when I woke up, the pain was so bad, I could barely walk on it. I had really flared it up and made it worse than ever. And I, of all people, should have known that this could have been a recipe for disaster. I, of all people, know the importance of listening to your body, okay? And so I'm saying this because even though you know what's best for you and you understand injury risk, you can still make mistakes, right? We all make mistakes and get caught up in the spirit of the game and the desire to compete and improve our skills. This is the most common source for former athletes flaring up their pain or creating a new pain situation, is that we get into these situations where the spirit of the game and the competition take precedence over listening to our bodies, because time and time again, as young athletes, we were taught to ignore our bodily symptoms in order to compete and to finish the game and to not let our team down and to not let our coach down and to not let ourselves down, right? This is really common. But looking back, there was a little bit of shame around, how did I let this happen? I should have done this. I should have done that. How did I not do that? And I think this is a really common experience around pain, and especially chronic pain, that we want to assign blame to something, right? And oftentimes that results in a lot of shame spiraling, which just isn't helpful for helping you move forward. What we can do in these times is recognize that shame is there, recognize why we might be feeling that way, talk to someone about it. This is really where it can be helpful to talk to a professional, and accept responsibility where there should be responsibility taken, and find a way to learn from your experience and move forward. So after allowing myself to briefly be very angry and frustrated, that's what I tried to do. So this is the part of the podcast where I want to go into what happened next, what I decided to do, how I managed it, and how it's doing now. However, I'm paying attention to the time, and I promised myself that I would not do a solo episode for longer than 30 minutes. So in order to really give that last part the time that I think it deserves, and so that you can learn the most out of my experience, I'm going to make this a two-parter. So this is part 1. I'm going to wrap up the podcast here and then have a part 2. However, before you go, I do want to let you know a little bit more about what's been going on at Fortitude behind the scenes and what you can expect this fall. So if you've been listening to this episode and thought, damn, I could really use some support and guidance on how to manage this chronic issue I do have a few more one-on-one online rehab and fitness coaching spots available for the rest of the year. You can book a free discovery call at the link in the show notes to find out if I can help you and we'd be a good fit, or you can shoot me a DM on Instagram and we can set up a time to chat there. And if you're not really looking for one-on-one coaching, but you still want a little bit of structure and accountability for helping you take care of a chronic or persistent pain that you have, I'm also working on a course to help former athletes with persistent pain get back to their desired activities, where I will be offering some live support, and then of course there will be a guided education portion, which you will go through creating a plan for how to get you back to where you want to be. That will be coming out this fall, and I'll be releasing all of the details soon to my email newsletter list. So I'd recommend jumping on that list if you're not there already, so you don't miss out on any of those details. I will add that link to join my email list in the show notes as well. And lastly, for the podcast, like I said earlier, I've got some really great guest interviews lined up that I cannot wait to share with you. I've already interviewed several of them. They are awesome, awesome conversations and awesome people. So stay tuned for those. And that is all for now. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being here and supporting the show. If you liked this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it if you leave me a rating or review or share this podcast with someone who you think might benefit. It really helps me spread the word and get to more people. And that's it. I will talk to you again soon. Have a good one and take good care of yourself.